Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Bill Daniels, and I'm the program leader for Native Seed Communities, which is a project of the Indiana Native Plant Society. We're very glad that you're here joining us for Nathan Pugh's presentation, Installing and Establishing Your Own Prairie. Before I introduce Nathan, I'd like to share with you some information about Native Seed Communities. We promote networks of native plant enthusiasts working together regionally to procure, to process, and to propagate native plant seeds, and with the whole purpose of increasing these beautiful and ecologically appropriate native plants in all of our landscapes. Our presentations are devoted to discussing the propagation of native plants from seeds and also spotlighting those organizations and individuals that mobilize native plant enthusiasts to use these seed-grown plants in their local landscapes. We have a lot of resources on the web, as well as we've got some social media areas that you can go to, and those will be shared in the chat here in a little while. A few final notes before we get to Nathan. For the best experience for everyone, if you please keep yourself muted, unless of course you're invited to unmute. Also, if you have a question, please pop those into the chat, and then Deb Housen, who's helping tonight as the moderator, she will field those questions, and we will wait until the very end to answer all of those questions. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started then with Nathan's introduction. Nathan Pugh is the Director of Restoration Services for Heartland Restoration Service Incorporated in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Nathan earned his bachelor's degree in wildlife biology from Ball State University. Through his experiences in college, he gained a greater appreciation and desire to care for our natural areas. He started with an Indiana Department of Natural Resources program treating invasives in one of the state parks. From there, he went to Heartland Restoration Services as a field supervisor, and then eventually he became the director 2 years ago. I'm very happy to give you Nathan Pugh.
Thank you.
All right, Nathan.
All right. Ooh. Let's get that up. All right, everybody see that okay? All righty, fantastic.
Gotcha.
So you already did the introduction, Nathan from Heartland Restoration Services. And so I'm going to go over today kind of the process of installing and establishing a prairie on your own property. This kind of comes from experience of our company doing this for a multitude of other property owners. But I'd like to share some of those experiences with you guys today. So maybe you can tackle these sorts of projects on your own if you so desire. Is it going to? Here we go. So I'm going to go over the kind of the process. So the first step in the process is probably one of the most important steps, and I will go in more detail over all of these throughout the presentation. So the site preparation is probably the most important part of the whole process, followed by the actual installation of the seed, and then the management of the area post-installation, which includes the establishment phase, which is the first 1 to 3 years of the actual establishment post-installation. And then I will also go over some of the long-term things that need to be done for the health of that prairie system. And as this is kind of all about native seeds, I will start with where the seed comes from, especially on our end. So we do have a nursery. So when we do all these prairie installations, the majority of the seed that we put in the ground comes from our own nurseries. And so we manage these nurseries, try to keep them, as clean as we can, keep weed seeds out, all that sort of stuff. We just kind of wrapped up last week collecting the last bit of our seed for this year. And so the nursery is really the pinnacle of getting all of the seed that we need to do these installations. And so regardless of where you get the seed from, if you're getting it from a native propagator, they will likely also have a nursery set up where they collect their own seed. This is what we call the cold room. And so after we collect all of the seed, it ends up in this room. And so that left side picture is kind of all of the unprocessed seed, all the stick matter, all the flower matter that's not actually the seed material. And so during the winter months, we process all of that get it down to the raw seed material, and it ends up turning out to that right side picture where, you know, it's just in smaller bags or in stock that can fit inside of a box, just for the sake that there's so much other stick material that we have that when we process it down, it becomes quite a small volume. So site preparation. Like I said, it's the most important part of the whole process. As far as large scale solutions, we usually do herbicide applications. And I know that some people are averse to using herbicide on their property, but in large scale areas, that is probably the cheapest and most efficient way of doing so. So if you are wanting to do a large scale area, you're just going to have to kind of bite the bullet on that one, and use some herbicide to try to kill off all of the existing plant material. If you're doing a small scale area, say it's a backyard area or somewhere smaller on your property, we actually recommend using a tarp. So a tarp will accomplish very similar. If you don't want to use herbicide and you're doing a small area, tarping will accomplish the same thing. So it blocks the sunlight from any of that plant material. It does require a little bit of attention to it. You don't want that tarp flipping up or anything causing a disturbance of that area so that it continues to block that sunlight. As far as how long you keep it on there, it's, again, you have to keep on monitoring it. So if you have it on there for, say, 2 weeks and nothing's dying, you're just going to keep it on there until you see some die off. And so if you're doing the tarping, I actually recommend, if you do see die off, taking that tarp off that area and seeing if anything regrows. If anything regrows, you're going to do a second application. Same thing goes for the herbicide. So if you do a spring application, you're going to want to let it die off and let any sort of regrowth occur, because a lot of those annual weed species will take advantage of that absence of what you just killed off. And so it'll rebound, and you want to do that spray again. If we do a herbicide application, we usually save that for the spring and or the fall. We don't like doing it in the summer. Usually in the summer months, everything is pretty hot. Plants are much less accepting of the plant material or of the chemical. And so we try to save that for the cooler months, just so that the plants will actually uptake the herbicide properly. So kind of some pictures to give you a visual as far as what that's going to look like throughout the process. So the before picture, kind of weedy, kind of a fallow field, not much going on there. The after picture, everything ideally will be killed off. If you do not get a full kill off and there's some spots that you missed or some spots that didn't die, you should probably do an immediate treatment afterwards to try to keep everything on the same page. So if you get, a couple spots 2 weeks later, retreat them, try to keep everything on the same level. Clean edges, other important things. So you can see on the right side picture, there's a lawn space next to it. We don't have any sort of drift, any overkill. So whenever you are doing these prairie areas, try to keep everything within the limits of what you're trying to kill off. So I put an asterisk there on the after. It's not the end of it. You need to do a reapplication. So picture of a regrowth. This is these 4 pictures are all the same area. So you get some regrowth, get some green up. You're going to wait for that green up to get some height to it, get some plant material there so you can get some more herbicide application on it. Spray it again, another after picture. Everything died off. You can kind of see left side picture, that's the spring. They did the reapplication. Second picture, fall. Everything's kind of going dormant, but you can see that everything was killed off properly. So an overview, again, most important step, you're trying to eliminate any competition that could potentially interfere with any of these native seeds trying to establish themselves. Any annuals, any biannuals, I'm talking Queen Anne's lace, teasel, thistle, anything of that nature. We want to get that stuff out of there. If you're doing a lawn space, usually we recommend 2 treatments. If you're doing a fallow field, like I had shown previously, it could potentially take up to 3. It really depends on the situation. If the fallow field does not see a lot of rebound after that second application, you can move into seeding. If you get some growth afterwards, you might want to reapply. We've actually had projects of our own that we've done. We've had to do 4 applications just because the weed rebound was so aggressive.
It's the
We
light
want to try to
you gotta
we want to try to get that
Yeah.
establishment, best we can to improve the results. Last thing is timing. Like I said, spring, fall. If you're getting some drought weather like we've been having, probably not the best time to do an herbicide application. Even in the spring or the fall, if we do have drought, try to time that around some rain events so you get some action within the plant, so that herbicide will actually be uptaked and moved throughout the plant. It's supposed to be translocated in the plant anyways. So drought events, high heat, any of those sorts of extreme conditions can limit the effectiveness of your herbicide treatment. So make sure your timing is relevant to when you want to do the installation. So installation, I like breaking down the installation into kind of 3 categories of what, when, and how. And so the what I'll go over now. So I want to kind of put this up to kind of a match game as far as what you want to put down. So there are 6 things that I like to look for whenever I'm doing an installation for what I want to install as the prairie. So I look at the soil type, I look at the sunlight exposure, is it partly sunny? Is it next to a house or a building? Is there a bunch of trees around it? Is it going to be shaded for half the day? That plays a factor in what species we want to select for that mix, as well as hydrology. How wet is it going to be? If it is in that shady area, it might not necessarily be wet. It might could still be dry, it's just shaded. And so you'll, play with those 3 categories and try to match the species that you want to put in the area to those 3 categories so that they survive the best as possible. Location, location, location. We like to boast, especially from our company, because we do this, is local genotype. Try to source your seed mix from a local nursery. It does not necessarily have to be ours. There's 3 or 4 other nurseries within our state that deal with this. And if you can't find one that fits your budget within our state, try to stay within the same hardiness zone. So if it's within the northern portion of the United States, going up to Michigan or Wisconsin, Ohio, Illinois, somewhere in there, just to make sure that the species that they're growing are adapted to our climate. So what you don't want to do is I've heard stories of this. People buy their seed from Texas just because it's cheaper, but the seeds that they're growing in Texas are acclimated to the climate in Texas. And so they don't tolerate the frost that we get up here. And so they actually installed the prairie, went well for the first couple of years, and then everything just died out just because it could not handle rebounding after those long winters. And so make sure that whatever you do buy a mix, it's from a local area, just so that you have the best chance of surviving. I get asked this question a lot of whether you should go perennial or annual for the seed mix. I prefer perennials for the most part, just because you don't have to worry about any sort of upkeep for the annuals. Annuals tend to fade if there's not enough room for them to grow. There's nothing saying you can't have annuals in your mix. It's just that if you want prolonged exposure of the different flowers that you want to see, perennials is the best way to go. There's also nothing saying you can't supplement annuals every year if you want to. Just make sure, again, you're trying to stick to the aesthetic that you're going for. Thing that we primarily deal with is PLS, pure live seed. I'm probably preaching to a lot of people here. They probably know about this, but all of the seeds that we sell have to be tested for viability, and we can only sell up to that point. So say something is 80% viable, 80% of the seed that you're going to get from that stock is going to be good seed, 20% is not, but the bulk weight is going to be 100% live seed based off of what you're purchasing. So again, make sure that wherever you're buying from is pure live seed. I know some people buy packets. We don't deal with packets, so I don't know exactly the statutes for those, but typically they send them, they pack packets full of just an X number of seeds. They're not necessarily tested. Just because you get the seeds doesn't necessarily mean that they're good. So just be mindful of that if you are ordering seed from somewhere else, that you are getting pure live seed of that mix. Aesthetic is another thing. So when I go into site meetings, one of the first things I will ask property owners is, what do you want this to look like? So do you want short grass? Do you want tall grass? How much flower coverage do you want? Do you have preferences on location of these flowers? Do you have any wet spots that you want to see something else in? So what you want your prairie to look at, I would say the majority of the time I get requests for short grass prairies just because they get to see the flowers easier. That's really the good selling point of that mix. But for your own property's sake, I do have some people that have requested tall grass prairies just because they want to make a screen out of it. So if you want your prairie to be a screen from your neighbors, then do so. Make it a tall grass prairie and go for it. Another thing that I get asked is whether or not people should use cover crops. In our mixes, we do use cover crops purely for the sake that it bulks up the seed mix and makes it easier for installation purposes. But it also makes it easier for establishment. So the cover crops are annuals, they'll pop up. They'll actually block out some of those other annuals that you don't want reseeding. The cover crop usually doesn't reseed itself all that aggressively, so it allows for that establishment phase to go a lot easier. So if you are getting a mix and the company you are buying from offers the ability to put cover crop in there, I would recommend going for using a cover crop. And so if you match all of these things up to what you're using for your project, you lead to the seed mix that's just right for your property. So the when, as far as installation is concerned, there are kind of two avenues that you can go for. There's a spring or fall installation, and then there's a dormant seeding as well. Industry standard is usually dormant seeding. Dormant seeding just allows for that seed to work its way into the soil better, and allows it to kind of incorporate itself and get established as soon as possible in the spring. Once you actually do get that frost break, and everything starts warming up, it'll just start growing immediately. Spring and fall is typically, it's not necessarily a bad thing if you install them in these time frames. It really depends on the situation and kind of when your herbicide was applied. Say your final herbicide application was in the spring, you don't really have much of a choice aside from the spring installation. But say your last herbicide application was in the fall, you can wait for a dormant application if you want, or you can do a fall installation if you want something down a little sooner. If you're doing a spring or fall installation, the most imperative time to do that is when you are on side slopes. So we usually use that for erosion control purposes. So if you're on a steep slope, or you have a creek or a stream or something that you're wanting to seed in natives, trying to get that down during the growing season would be imperative to keep soil in place. So if you are doing an area that has side slopes, spring and fall is a must. I would not recommend usually doing a dormant seeding just because you're going to deal with some erosion issues. So the how, the two methods that would kind of be most applicable to homeowners would be no-till drill seeding. You can actually rent these if you so wish. Pheasants Forever, I know, has a rental program. I'm sure maybe the NRCS might have a few, but there are some programs out there that might have drill seeders available for home use that can be rented. You might also check rental establishments. I don't know if they carry seeders. They might carry drop seeders. So that's another option, but very similar to a no-till drill seeding process. Another application would be broadcast. And so broadcast seeding, you can see in the picture, they're just using, we call that a monkey grinder, but you can use a PTO spreader on the back of a tractor. You can hand cast. So broadcasting can be done in a lot of different ways. So which is better? Again, it depends on your situation and what you're doing. So the pros and cons of drill seed installation. Drill seeding installation, you can kind of see the establishment easier. Everything is in rows. So if you see something popping up outside of your rows, you know that that's a problem species, typically. But the majority of your mix will be established within those rows, and you can see it happen. Another benefit is that it pushes that seed into the ground more. So you get that seed to soil contact better in a drill seeding application versus a broadcast application. Cons, again, cost. You will have to rent the equipment or borrow the equipment. You'll have to have access to a tractor that can use it. So there are some limitations as far as what you can do to get that drill seeder and get that installation done that way. If you're doing a broadcast application, again, anybody can do a broadcast application by hand. You can get a spreader. I'm pretty sure fertilizer spreaders would probably work so long as you wash it fairly well and you get that fertilizer residue out of there. You don't want that kind of mucking up your seed mix. You could use drop seeders. That would work just fine. Hand broadcast would work just fine. So there's a lot of different ways that you can broadcast. It's a lot cheaper and a lot more user access. If you are doing broadcast seeding, usually I recommend rolling or crimping some sort of way to get that seed into the ground better. I've seen people kind of flip I don't know, flip harrows over, just to kind of keep the tines off the ground, but get that kind of the rougher metal material going across the ground, kind of rough it up a little bit, get it worked in there. If you're doing a really small area, you can use a hand rake, but try to get that seed to soil contact a little better than what you just casting onto the ground, just to allow for that seed to work its way into the soil. I know there's a seed thing, but plants are also another way of establishing an area, especially on a small scale. So if you are looking for plant material, again, I would recommend going local source as much as possible. Anything that you would look for out of a standard landscape nursery, you would also look for native plants, good roots, no disease, no insect damage, etc. Again, goes back to the aesthetic, what you're spacing, what do you want the place to look like. So your goals, you need to kind of think about that and establish what you want if you are doing a landscaping or a little back garden, what you want it to look like ultimately. Because if you are doing plants, where you put it is where it's probably going to be for the majority of its life. Another thing that I get asked a lot is, do you use mulch? Usually I would say yes, just to keep it acts more as a weed barrier more than anything else. So it would help establishing those plants a lot better. You don't have to worry about weeding it as much. But over time, if you want that area to fill in more and let it be more natural, you don't have to use mulch. But as far as an installation standpoint, up front, mulch might not be a bad idea. So an overview, choose the right material. Again, goes back to that match game that I did earlier. Make sure that your seed mix will work for your property. Timing, do you want a dormant seed? That right picture is the area that broadcast picture was from. So we broadcasted it, and then we put straw mulch on top of it and crimped that in. So that was our method of getting that broadcast seeding pushed into the ground better. Timing, make sure, if you're doing a dormant seeding, get it down when it's frozen. If you're doing a spring or fall seeding, much less, you don't have to worry as much about when you get it down, so long as you give it enough time to actually get that germination. And then proper method for the situation. Do you have the funds or the means of getting a drill seeder and using a tractor to put it in, or a drop seeder? Or do you want to use some sort of broadcast method? So choose the right method that suits your project. Okay, going into the last one, management. And so I've heard this quote a lot, and I just kind of put it on here. Natural systems tend to take care of themselves. And I tend to not agree with that wholeheartedly. So I usually put an asterisk at the end. Because sometimes they don't. With so much human intervention in natural systems, as far as invasive species is concerned, other introduced species that aren't necessarily in their native range anymore, that are causing some nuisance issues, those need managed. And so natural systems do take care of themselves with some intervention, because there is also some other outside intervention that is making them not stay natural anymore. So we're going to go into the establishment. So when you're looking at your establishment first and second year, you're going to look at a lot of annual and biannual growth. And so this picture is of a project that we installed many years ago, but still relevant. A lot of daisy fleabane, a lot of Queen Anne's lace. You're going to see a lot of those annuals and biennials popping up the first or second year, usually less so in the second year, but especially in the first year. This is not a time to overreact. Your seed mix is still there. Just because you have a flush of some annuals doesn't mean that your prairie mix is not establishing itself. So don't freak out. Trust that the mix is going to do what it's supposed to do. So you just need to do some management to try to get rid of these annuals. The number one thing that we recommend in these circumstances is to do a high mow. So if you have access to a mower or a bush hog that can go on a tractor, and you can raise that deck up to about 6 to 8 inches, that would be the ideal height. Get that mown off at that height. It'll chop off all the flower heads, make sure that those annuals don't go to seed. So that's the goal as far as the establishment phase is concerned, is to make sure that those annuals don't reestablish themselves over time. If you ignore that process, this is all you're going to get, is you're going to get a flush of annuals and biennials, and your prairie mix is going to come in kind of patchy. So you want to mow all that down. What that primarily does, one, gets rid of the seed head, make sure that those don't go to seed. Secondarily, it also allows sunlight to penetrate down to the soil surface and allow the perennials to get the sunlight they need to establish themselves. Again, like I said before, not all circumstances lead to this. I have seen many prairie installations that this doesn't necessarily occur, but they deal with a perennial issue later on that I will go over in the long-term management. So by year 3, you're going to see a fast increase in native presence. But as you can see from this picture, there are some stragglers as far as problematic species that we need to take care of. So we've got some curly dock in there. I typically don't like that in prairie systems. You might have some Queen Anne's lace. You might have some teasel. Maybe it established itself year 2, but it's a biennial, so you didn't see it till year 3. And you also might start to see some perennial issues. So if you get some Canada goldenrod or Canada thistle in there, those would be the ones that pop up primarily in the 3rd year as well. So you'll want to keep out for those. As far as management in the 3rd year, mowing usually isn't necessary because you have so much native presence. Usually we go with sort of spot treatments. So if you see some annuals or some perennials or annuals or biennials that you don't want, sometimes spin trimming works. Get in there, spot spin trim them down, cut them down. Accomplish the same thing as the mowing, but you're doing on a much smaller scale, localized area, so that you don't impact the rest of the prairie. If you're dealing with some perennial issues, usually I would recommend some herbicide treatment or just hand pulling. If you don't want to go that route, hand pulling would also work if you're dealing with not too many of them. Time it pretty well, get some moist soil in there, the roots will come up easier, should be good to go. So as far as what you can do on your end, like I said, mowing is the best practice. Like that picture there, that's about the height that you want it to be. It doesn't have to be super short. It's not a lawn. It is a prairie still. So try to mow it 6 to 8 inches. I think that picture is probably closer to 6 inches. So if you want to go a little higher than that, that would be totally fine. Like I said, spot treatments with herbicide. As far as the management on our side, we do transects. So we usually pick a line, walk that line, turn around, walk another line, just to make sure that we don't miss anything. Because if you miss it, it's probably going to go to seed and you're going to cause more issues later down the line again. So you're going to have to keep managing it. So the more on top of it you can be at the start, the better you will be long-term as far as the health of the prairie. And manage it what you can do on your schedule. If it's too much area for you to do at one time, you don't have to necessarily have to do it all at once. If you want to pick a weekend, do a 10th of it. Do a 10th of it. If you want to do a quarter of it, do a quarter of it, and then you can kind of space it out over time. Just make sure you get those things out of there before they go to seed. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a daunting process up front. So kind of space it out on your schedule when you have free time. Just make sure that you try to establish it as best you can up front so that your long-term goals are met. I would say if you don't have a ton of time, focus on priority species. If you get some Queen Anne's lace, not the worst species to have in your prairie. It's not going to absolutely blow everything out. Canada goldenrod, on the other hand, will. If you get some Canada goldenrod in there, Canada thistle, those tend to spread very aggressively. I would focus on those more than anything. But so if you don't have a ton of time and you want to try to focus on something, I would focus on very specific hardy species that are hard to get rid of. Once it's fairly well established, there's probably not going to be a ton of maintenance that you need to do. Our prairie at our office, I think, has been established for about 20 years. We still have a little bit of management to do, but it's usually not on a grand scale. Granted, not at the 20-year mark, you're not going to see that. You're probably going to see that around year 5. But prolonged, it's going to be that way from 5 to 20, and probably thereon. So your long-term management is not going to be nearly as bad. So that kind of segues into what you need to do for long-term management for your prairie systems. I get requests for prescribed fire probably more than anything. If you're in a residential area, that becomes a bit more complicated. But if you live out in the middle of nowhere, it's much easier to accomplish because you don't have neighbors to worry about. If you are doing prescribed fire, if it's on a small scale, doing it yourself probably isn't that big of a deal. If you're doing large tracts, 15, 20, 50 acres, I would recommend going and trying to find a contractor to do it for you. That large of an area is very difficult to manage on your own. And especially you want to get somebody that knows what they're doing. So if you're doing a large tract area, I would recommend getting a contractor to do a prescribed burn for you if you want to go that route. On years that we don't do prescribed burning, we usually recommend doing some sort of mowing to chop up that plant material. So what that does is it helps it break down a little faster, gets that sunlight penetration into the soil so that those perennials have a chance to pop up a little easier. There's not as much shade in the spring. And so usually we leave our dead material up through the majority of the winter, give some cover for small mammals and stuff of that nature, get some bedding for deer. But then we usually mow it kind of late February going into March when we start getting that thaw cycle. They don't need it as much because it's starting to warm up and they're probably going to be able to find food a little easier. So we mow it down. I've seen birds go crazy whenever we mow it down. They use a bunch of the plant material for their nests, stuff of that nature. So usually I recommend a later mowing in the winter. Spot spraying, again, focus on the priority species, like I said earlier, but that's going to be a continual thing that you might have to do because like I said, they take care of themselves, but with some intervention. And so the continued intervention with spot spraying or spot treating is probably going to be the most intervention that you're going to need to do. Another question that I get asked quite frequently is, do I need to add more seed over time? If you're doing annuals, probably. If you're just doing perennials, not unless you want to. If you see kind of a fading of a species that you like, certainly add that species back in there. Bump it up a little bit. There's nothing saying you can't do that. You just, find areas that you want it, or bare, areas where more dirt is exposed, just put the seed there. It has more chance of getting established there and spreading. So interseeding is certainly a possibility, but not necessary if you don't want to. And so I also get asked this quite often is, why does it take so long for this establishment phase to get done? Why doesn't it act like anything else and just it's there and you don't have to worry about it anymore? And so we like showing this picture off. And so on the right-hand side, you'll see the top and bottom structure of a very typical lawn grass, which is Kentucky bluegrass. Very short root system, very short, upper area, herbaceous area. So it doesn't take long for that to get there and get going. Versus everything else in that picture, which are all native prairie plants. You can see the root structure system is much larger. So it takes them a while to get to that point. And so what we usually say is, if you see something above ground at a certain height, it usually is mirroring that below ground. So the taller the plant, usually the longer it takes to establish itself to the point where it looks like this. And so, we get those vast root systems in there. It's going to take a minute for that to get to that point. It might not necessarily use that full root system all year round, but especially in periods of drought, it might. And so that's why it takes so long to get that going. So a little bit of an overview. Establishment phase, short term, mowing, spin trimming, spot treatments of what you don't want, heavy attention. Establishment phase is probably one of the most important times. Make sure that you get it going in the right direction, and your long term is going to be much, much easier. Again, long term is an ongoing process. It's not as much intervention, nearly as much intervention as the establishment phase. Periodic checking, making sure that it's going in the direction that you want it to see. So, making sure you get those invasives out of there, get those nuisance species out of there, and you can use resources. I'm available. If you have other contractors that you bought seed from, ask them, what should I be seeing, etc. So use your resources that you have available to you. So this kind of all goes in a circle to personal preferences, sustainability. Like I said, do what you can when you can, but also scale what you're trying to put in the ground to that process as well. So what do you have time to establish? So if you don't have time to take care of a 25 acre of land, don't establish 25 acres. Start it out, 5 acres. See if you can manage that. If you want to establish it in phases, that's also helpful. If you will give me one moment, I forgot to plug my laptop in, so I'm running low on battery. Okay. So make sure that you can manage the area that you're trying to establish. Personal preference, again, goes back to what you want it to look like, the aesthetic of it all, and making sure you know what that is supposed to look like. So if you go into it with an idea of the area that you want it to look like, it's much easier to manage if you can work towards that goal. So I touched a lot on large scale areas. So this is supposed to kind of span the scope of large scale to small scale. So I'm going to touch a bit more on the small scale areas. So I kind of play on words for pocket prairie. It's actually an ecological system type, west of here. But I like referring it to that way as kind of pocket areas that people put on smaller plots, kind of way stations, if you want to call them that as well. So little prairie units that people can put on small tracts, probably I usually less than a half acre. So it's little itty bitty areas, nice little pollinator area. It's not going to, host a bunch of larger mammals or birds or anything like that. But it does provide some pollinator benefit as well. I'll also touch a little bit on landscaping and rain gardens, because some people don't necessarily have the land to do prairie-sized units, but they can, definitely incorporate these sorts of ideas into smaller areas on their property, around their landscaping, or in rain gardens. So I'll kind of go in reverse here. I kind of went with where it all starts for the seed. So I'll kind of do the same thing for the plants. And so that bottom tray is all propagated from seed. So we call that open flats. So we'll start everything in an open flat, wait for it to get to a certain size, and then that person there is in the process of transplanting from the open flat into a plug. And so then we'll transplant it, allow that plug to establish itself within the pot, and then it'll be ready for sale. What we see, kind of these are our wet species, so we'll put them in pools filled with water so that they can grow in the environment that they want to grow in naturally. So we kind of mimic that within the greenhouse, but as well as, upland species. So all of those are trays of plugs of upland species that we establish in other areas outside of, just raw seeding. So all of those are propagated from seed, and it can be established in an area a little bit differently. So in landscape setting, again, kind of what do you want it to look like? So the pictures there, the left picture is from a college over in Warsaw called Grace College. We did an installation around their science building. This was all planned out and designed. But if you go into that with that mindset of kind of a design that you want it to look like, you can properly place the plants that you want in your landscaping to match the desired look that you want. The right photo was directly after an installation that we did on an individual's property. We had gone back there since then and done some more installations, and I tell you that those plants are the biggest I've ever seen those plants get in a landscape setting. I saw, penstemon, which is usually a shorter species, and I saw the flower head sticking clear up to my chest. So landscape settings can still be extremely beneficial as far as getting natives established on your own property, even if you don't have the land to do so. Rain gardens, we like boasting these areas, especially for hard to establish areas. Like you can't get you got a little wet spot. You can't get long grass to establish there. You can't mow it all the time just because it holds water too much. We see that as a great opportunity to create a rain garden. You can incorporate that space into your landscaping on your property, make it a rain garden, get to see some other species that you wouldn't see in a prairie setting, get some of those wetland species going. There are plenty of nice looking wetland species that'll grow great in a rain garden and look just as good as the prairie flowers do. So not all wetland species are just drab and just green space. There are some great flowers that you can also get established in these areas as well. And so when we talk about prairie systems and incorporating them into landscaping, or even in just the larger scale of prairies, are you ready for it to look messy? Because even in landscaping, if you establish a plant in a certain spot, it's not necessarily going to stay there. Some plants spread by their roots. Some of them drop seed very aggressively, and those seeds are going to grow up in your landscaping in other places. And so up front, we try to warn people that if you want to incorporate natives into your property, to make sure that you're ready to see it kind of be unruly and grow as natives do, and kind of be this hodgepodge mix of everything. It's not necessarily in its designated spot as per se. And we also don't necessarily try to preach, just staying native. Mixing and matching is certainly an option. Trying to incorporate natives, even if you already have established landscaping. So you have an open spot because something else died out. you can incorporate natives in there. So we've gotten that right picture. We've got some Joe Pyeweed in the back, but there's still hostas that they've got in their regular landscaping. And you can tier stuff. You can do all sorts of cool things for landscaping. I know the right-of-way areas here in Fort Wayne, the individual leading that project is incorporating natives like crazy in the right-of-way areas. But he's not necessarily using true natives either. Sometimes he's using a cultivar, and that's in a landscape setting. That's not necessarily a bad thing. They're easier to manage. They're more tolerant to different conditions, which is why they are cultivared usually. And so long as they're natives and they're incorporated, I think it's still a boost to the aesthetic of using natives in landscaping and using it in everyday life, trying to reduce the amount of introduced species in our areas and make stuff look good. And again, this is where I kind of like leaving it off. It's your property. Kind of do what you want. It's, what do you want it to look like? What do you want to do? Choose the species you want to choose. Again, make sure that they work, but it's your property. Kind of make it how you want it to be, and work towards that. And contractors can give suggestions and all that sort of stuff. And I'll, if you contact me, I can give suggestions. But ultimately it comes down to you because it's your property and you're doing the establishment. So go for it. And so that is the end of my presentation. I think transition into questions if people have any.
This is Deb Housen. Nathan, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much. It would be great to have 40, 50 acres to do all of these great things. Instead, a lot of us have, a half acre or even smaller. So the ability to do some of this still within the parameters of what we
I think we lost you there, Deb.
Yeah, Deb, are you still there?
now here in November, can they be killed or hacked to prevent them from bolting next year? Or is it too late?
You cut out kind of at the beginning of that question. Could you repeat it for me?
Sure can. So the teasel, right now in November, the basil leaves are out and are green. Can they still be killed or hacked away to prevent them from bolting next year?
So if you're doing a dormant season, I kind of consider this the dormant season spraying, and stuff is some certain species are still green, like the teasel. If you are doing an herbicide application, be prepared for it to not work as fast as you think it will. Nothing is really growing. There's nothing necessarily saying that it won't take up the herbicide, but you might not see death for quite a while. So if it's still green going into next spring, I would probably wait till then. But if you want to try it now, I would actually use a hotter rate of herbicide. So if your usual rate for a growing season application is 2%, maybe double that. Just make sure it's staying within the bounds of what the herbicide, the SDS says that you can do. But if it's glyphosate or something like that, 4% is certainly within the bounds of what glyphosate should be sprayed at. So if you are doing kind of a later season application and stuff is still green, I would recommend doing a little bit of a hotter rate to make sure that it uptakes that herbicide better.
Great, thank you. Next question is regarding rain garden. So this person has a dip in their front yard that's mostly dry, but it does regularly collect water when it rains. So the concern is that the plants will die when it goes into the dry spell and we aren't having the rain and the wetness it collects. Right.
So rain gardens, I guess, is kind of a misnomer in a way. So they collect the rain, but they don't necessarily stay wet. So the areas that we actually, there's a bunch of rain gardens that we manage throughout the city of Fort Wayne, and they are really only wet in the spring. And the rest of the season, you could fool me to say it's not landscaping. So the majority of those rain gardens actually stay dry for the majority of the season, but that's the hydrology of the soil down below is usually wetter because anytime you get a rain event, it funnels to that area. And so you can certainly select species that can tolerate that dryness. So there's some sedges that you can do. You can do fox sedge, that works really well. Iris works really well. You could do some swamp milkweed in there, that would probably work. So there's certainly a selection of species that are tolerant to those sorts of conditions, that they're super inundated in the spring, but then you get into the summer months and it just stays dry all the time. They will still tolerate those conditions as well.
Okay, great. We tend to think of prairies being in full sun, but are there seed mixes that you could recommend for dry, shady areas?
So shady areas gets into a little bit of a pickle as far as if it's full shade, it's hard to call it a true prairie. There are not a ton of warm season species that will tolerate full shade. Now, if it's partial shade, you can do all sorts of stuff. A bunch of the rye species are partial shade species. You can get those established. I'm pretty sure you can get big blue stem to establish in partial shade. There's a bunch of flowers. You can get spotted Joe Pyeweed to go into partial shade. You can get wing stem, wild columbine. So there's still a ton of selection when you get into partial shade. When you get into full shade, that becomes a little harder because if you think full shade, you're thinking, a forest understory. There's not the herbaceous layer there is not necessarily considered prairie. It's more of, you get your gingers, you get your bloodroots, you get some of the cooler species that are, some of the spring ephemerals are especially popular in shaded areas. So you don't get a ton of, warm season grasses or anything that you would typically see in a prairie system. So I would say in a full shade situation, no, but there are still tons of plants that work great in full shade situations. You just don't necessarily consider it a prairie.
Right. Okay. And I think someone had a comment that trees or shrub thickets can help with managing perennial prairie weeds. And I don't know if that was a question or a comment. And there's no question mark, so I'm going to assume that was a comment to the shade. If that's if that is to be a question, Jack, just let me know. Do you have any great suggestions for managing thistle without herbicide?
Oh, hand pulling is probably the number one way. It's not the greatest option, I know, because it's thistle and no one wants to pull thistle with their hands. But hand pulling is the best way. I know some people try to use some more, I guess you can call them organic mixes that involve soap or baking soda or something of that nature to hand wick. And so you can apply that to kind of a cotton glove. I would just recommend wearing some sort of, rubber glove underneath that so you're not getting it directly on your skin. But wearing some sort of cotton glove, you can apply that solution onto your hand, and then you can just wick that substance onto the plant material for uptake. And so you don't necessarily need a spray bottle to do that. I guess that kind of goes into another management method. Is hand wicking is another really great way of attacking some of these species without necessarily harming anything around it. But as far as ways of getting rid of thistle that doesn't involve herbicide, there's not a ton of great ways to do it aside from organic solutions and hand pulling. We do have one client that has contacted us about ways of getting rid of, they don't mind using herbicide, but they don't want to spray. So we recommended hand wicking, but she didn't necessarily want to do that because she didn't want to get on her hands. But another method that we sometimes use is a cut stump, which usually is recommended for invasive shrub removal or tree removal, where you cut the stem at the bottom and you treat the stump with herbicide, but you can technically still do that with herbaceous material so long as the stalk of that plant is big enough to get the herbicide to apply to it. If you're talking, smaller than a pencil, it's probably not going to work all that great, but thistles are typically pretty big as far as the stem stalk size is concerned. So if you don't want to touch any of the chemical, if that's what you're worried about, you can certainly, get some sort of dabber, put it, dip the dabber in the chemical and then apply that directly to that cut stem.
Good suggestions on that. I myself also have thistle, and it's a pain in what. Do you work with individuals that I presume they're in neighborhoods or that have HOA requirements.
We can work with it. So like when we have seed, we have, standard seed mixes that we sell. But we don't necessarily have to stick to that. We can customize any way we want because none of those mixes are pre-made due to the PLS testing that we have to do. And so any mix that you want to, that's why I was kind of saying, choose the species that you want because you can combine species in any way possible. And so as far as HOA concerns, we would just need to know those requirements ahead of time because we know a ton of people that have worked with us and they've got their own landscaping and they've incorporated native plants in there and they've got HOA requirements. Usually it's a height structure thing. And so we recommend plants that work in landscaping or work in prairie systems that are just short. And so you would just have to work with your HOA and bring it up to them and be like, hey, I want to do this. What do I need to do to accomplish it without violating any sort of rule? Once you get that established, then you can contact a contractor, see what they can do about it, or a provider of seed or plants or whatever, and be like, hey, do you have any plants that meet these requirements that would work in this setting, and go from there.
Great, thank you. We've got questions that keep rolling in, so I'll just keep going. What number of species are in some of your mixes, the native grasses, forbs, sedges, and etc.? And then of that, what are your favorites in a mix? Favorite species?
Yeah. So the mixes that we provide, we make them variable on purpose. And so we have very small mixes, and we call that very basic mixes, just to meet better, if people have a certain budget they can work with. We have smaller variety mixes to match that budget. And so typically those mixes, I think it has 4 grasses in it, and then it has, I think, 10 or 11 flowers. And so it's not a huge variety, but that also lowers the cost quite a bit to make it more reasonable for people to establish. But we also have mixes that go up to, I think, 7 graminoid species. And I think it has probably 26 or 27 flowers. And so we have a variety of ways that we can put stuff together. But we meet also that in the middle. I think it's got like 5 graminoids and 20 flowers or 18 flowers or something like that. So we can spread that out across many different ways to meet budgets that people have for their establishment purposes. That's for prairie systems. We also provide wetland mixes. Those are usually a bit more diverse in the graminoid department, and that can go up to 15 graminoids just because of all the sedges that you can put in. But then the flowers would typically match that, and it's usually around 18 flowers or so. So typically in wetland species mixes, the graminoids and flowers tend to match as far as variety is concerned, but in the prairies, it's usually less heavy on the graminoid variety and heavier on the flower variety.
Great, thank you. Many people are thanking you for a great presentation. We have one that's they've realized that the pocket prairie is a more realistic goal for them, which is well worth it. I think we'll have a lot of people in that regard. Appreciate the mention of the pocket prairie. Yes, doing herbicide on small stem stalks is a great option. Using blue dye helps show what's been done. Mm-hmm. What native grasses best mimic the appearance and durability of lawn grass? I know there is not a perfect match, but curious to hear your thoughts.
So typically, if you want to match lawn, we've put a couple of these in. Now, I don't know as far as the quote unquote nativeness of it is, but there are companies that do provide something called no-mow mixes, which very closely resemble lawn, but have kind of this weird wispy look to them. And so again, it's called a no-mow. You don't have to mow it at all, but it keeps that shorter stature so that you don't have to, it doesn't kind of look tall and obstructive. And so no-mow mixes would be great. If you're looking for a species that's pretty close to lawn, gosh, I don't know of anything short enough to match lawn. There's plenty of cool season grasses, so all of your rye's are cool season, so they'll still green longer. A bunch of your sedges are the same way. There is one that resembles sort of grass that we use in landscaping in shady areas called star sedge or Carex radiata. It's a very kind of the blades kind of laid down a lot, so it doesn't look quite as tall and gangly. And so it's not the greatest answer to your question, just because it's hard to match the shortness of lawn grass to a prairie species.
Yeah, that is kind of tough. Also asking, they're not sure whether clover is native, and I know there is a prairie clover that's native, but the question is, how do you feel about mixing clover with lawn grass? And I presume they're talking maybe about like the short white or purple clover.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ground clover. Ground clover is fine. Mix it with lawn grass so long as it's not going to spread too heavily, because I know some people, like especially if you get neighbors or your neighbor's lawn touches yours, probably keep it a little bit away from that, so that if they have problems with broadleaves growing in their lawn, that you don't have to worry about any qualms with them. But I don't usually see any problem with clover growing in lawn grass areas. As I'll kind of expand on that as far as clover is concerned with prairies. I typically don't recommend that sort of ground clover in a prairie system. Now, if you want to use a prairie clover, which is the dahlias, dahlia, I'm perfectly fine with. We incorporated that into a lot of our mixes. But I usually don't recommend them directly in the prairie. But as far as like CRP programs, they actually, when they do their design, they establish lanes within those prairies using ground clover. So all of their lanes are made with ground clover. That acts as a burn barrier. So if you are establishing those clover areas, they stay green for a very long time. So prescribed burns are a lot easier along those lanes. They make my job a lot easier as far as a contractor is concerned to doing those prescribed burns. But yeah, ground clover is great in lawn spaces.
Good. Let's see. I'll take probably 2 more questions, and then we'll be close to the top of the hour. There's a big thank you, kudos to Heartland. You planted the Stillwater Hospice Prairie in 2006.
Yep.
And after some restoration, it's looking great. You've helped in recent years, so a big thank you to you for that. All right, this caller has planning to convert an acre pasture that's essentially been an oversized lawn for decades. Consistently mowed with very little visible weeds, seem to be mostly grass, including a very thick zoysia grass that was introduced back in the 70s or maybe 80s. I feel like it wouldn't have too many of the weed struggles you've mentioned in the establishment phase with that kind of base. Is he wrong? Also wondering if it's possible to incorporate these native plant varieties into an already established lawn, or is it always necessary to do the mass kill before planting the native seeds?
So I'll address the first part as far as the kind of prep work for trying to establish an area that's already grass, that you don't see necessarily a lot of annuals or any problem species in there. For lawn spacing, like I said, I usually recommend 2 sprays. So you're wondering if you can just do one and then do the installation, probably. Usually I recommend no. So what happens a lot of the time is a bunch of those species that we're looking to spray on the second spray are lying dormant. So just because that grass is occupying that space doesn't necessarily mean that, there's not, I don't know, yellow nutsedge that's just dormant inside the soil substrate, waiting for that space to appear to propagate and go. And so usually we wait for that to happen to allow us to spray again. Now I've been asked whether you can kind of do an accelerated schedule. So like do your first application as soon as you get green up of those annuals right afterwards. Say you do a spring application, you get a flush immediately, say in late May, early June. Can you do an application? You can. And then if you want to do it as, do your application, then immediately follow that with an installation of seed. I would say you can do that, but be cautious because your establishment might be a little rougher. You might have to do some mowing in that fall, and then your first year establishment is still going to start that following year. So I think your establishment phase is probably still going to be the following year when you're going to see the majority of those annuals. So your establishment phase probably isn't still going to start until later, even if you do an accelerated prep phase to do the installation sooner. So just be warned in that regard. And then can you repeat the second part of that question again?
Sure. And I think basically you kind of answered that all in one. Could they actually just incorporate the seed into an established lawn?
Yes. So I've been asked this before, and it's very difficult because a lot of those lawn species are creeping. They occupy open space, so their roots are going to spread that way, and any empty soil substrate they're going to occupy and fill, and that's why they kind of do this mix of clump and creeping grasses in lawn spaces to occupy all available soil space. And so when you try to establish seed in an area that has no open space, they're not going to be able to grow all that well, especially your grasses. So if you get warm season grasses and you're trying to incorporate in there, they're probably not going to be that big because the clump grasses for prairies, I've seen stuff that are a foot round. And if that space isn't available, they're not going to get that big, and they have a hard time pushing that other stuff away. And so trying to establish in a established lawn space is very difficult because there's no available root space in the soil for them to actually get established. So if you are going to try to convert a lawn space, either do a full kill off, or you can, sometimes I've seen, people try to do like patches, or they do strips or something like that. If they don't want to do the full space and they still want access via lawn, they'll do, segments, and they'll convert that into prairie, just to make it easier for them to get in and out of.
Okay. Well, that's too bad though. I think that would be easy. So again, thank you so much for the information. I'm going to turn it over to Bill to wrap up. And I have posted Nathan's contact information along with other websites. So if anyone had any questions, I'm sure you would be happy to answer them via email.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, Deb. I appreciate very much you handling the moderating of the questions, and thanks everybody for not only being here, but for some excellent questions. And Nathan, thanks so much for your presentation. Very organized and very helpful. It was excellent. So, well, we'll go ahead and wind up now. If you do have any additional questions about Nathan's presentation or about native seed communities, feel free to reach out at the links. You can also send a note directly to seed@indiananativeplants.org. And if you'd like to be on our email list, we don't send out a lot of information. It's primarily just communicating our next presentations, because we do one of these per month. Feel free to join our Facebook group. We've got about 2,500 people that are following, and your pictures, your videos are very welcome about your propagation and any of the activities that your organization may be doing in your region. And as I mentioned, we do these on a monthly basis. Our next one is December the 12th. It's Tuesday night. It'll be, instead of 7 p.m., it'll be 5:30 p.m. It's with Allison Schoaf, and she's with the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and she'll be speaking on a similar topic, actually, programs and resources for creating pollinator habitat. In it, you'll learn more about the local, technical, and financial resources available to those who wish to restore native habitat. So I hope to see many of you there. Thanks again, Nathan. Thanks again, Deb. Thanks everyone for your terrific questions. And it was good to see you all. We'll sign off for now, and happy growing natives from seed. Bye-bye all.